Okay, so let's start. And surprise, surprise, going to be the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. I just checked, and the first when we started this sutta was in January 2017, so it's almost 3-year anniversary here. So it's going a long time. Hopefully it won't be as long as the nuns have a 10-year anniversary. Hopefully we'll finish it before 10 years. We'll see what happens. But it should be okay. Is anyone here who is here for the first time? Yeah, you are? Okay, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so we're in the middle of a long sutta. Sutta is a discourse by the Buddha. This is the middle of one, but it doesn't really matter because this particular sutta is almost like a compilation of various things. So if you're in the middle, it's perfectly okay. You don't have to worry too much about that. Some suttas, if you come in the middle, you have no idea what's going on. This one is not quite like that. So this sutta, just to remind everyone, because it's been 4 months now, I think, since we had the last of these sutta classes. So this sutta is about the final travel of the Buddha, where the Buddha travels from Rajagaha in Magadha, travels all the way to Kusinara, which is where he actually eventually passes away here. And it's a very fascinating and interesting sutta because it is much more historical than other suttas. It talks about the Buddha's voyage, all the things that happened en route up to the Kusinara. And of course, because the Buddha is aware that he is going to pass away very soon, he ensures that the teaching is properly delivered, and he kind of summarizes teachings. He tells his disciples what are the essential points and how they're going to live after he passes away, and all of that. And of course, all of this is very relevant to us because we are also at the time after the Buddha has passed away. So these are very interesting points that come out in this particular sutta. We're coming towards the very end now. And the Buddha has arrived in Kusinara, which is where he is about to pass away. He's already told everyone that he's going to pass away very soon. And he is lying down on a kind of a bed or whatever. It's a kind of primitive bed, I suppose, on the ground almost, between the famous twin sal trees. Sal trees are these magnificent trees that you find in the north of India. So he's lying there, and it's almost waiting to pass away. And in the meantime, of course, various things happen. And this is what we're looking at now, these things that are happening as the Buddha is waiting to pass away. And at this particular point that you can see here now, you can see that Venerable Ananda, who was the Buddha's faithful attendant for at least 20 years, he says to the Buddha, he says, please don't pass away here in Kusinara, because Kusinara is just this tiny little place, a dusty little town, like the kind of classic Western towns that you have in the cowboy movies, a dusty town for somewhere in the west. It's a bit the Indian equivalent of that. There was nothing much there, a few houses, maybe a few hundred people or something, but it was kind of far away. It wasn't very interesting. And Ananda said, why don't you instead pass away in one of these great cities? Because there were some large towns in India already at this point. Why not pass away there rather than this little hamlet in the middle of nowhere, which is kind of, really obscure and nobody knows about. And then the Buddha says, what the Buddha says is that here he says, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that this is a little hamlet, a jungle hamlet, a branch hamlet. I think the translation you have there is a bit different. I'm using a different translation just to confuse you a little bit. On that one there, it says, Ananda, don't call it a miserable little town of wattle and daub, right in the jungle in the back of beyond. So that's a bit more poetic, that particular translation. But you get the idea, somewhere far away, yeah? And then comes this long story that the Buddha tells next of the kind of ancient past of this little place called Kusinara. What a great city it was a long time ago. And all of this is quite interesting in a way. There's a lot of interesting little points here. And the first one is, well, why is it that the Buddha passes away in a tiny little village, far away from everything else? Why doesn't he pass away in one of the great towns and cities of India at that time? What is the reason for that? And Many possibilities, but one possibility, and I think I may have talked about this briefly before, but one possibility is just that the Buddha didn't want his funeral and everything to be very grand, high status and very kind of flashy or anything like that. The Buddha by nature wasn't a flashy person. He was someone who had given up the sense of self. There was no ego there anymore. He wanted things to be, small scale, easy to sort out, easy for his disciples to arrange for the funeral and things afterwards. Not something grand, which often means lots of people and maybe fighting and all these kind of things. He probably knew that there would be fights over his relics, his bodily remains after the cremation. And there almost was. They almost went to war after those relics afterwards. We'll see that later on. Not today, but at some other time. Maybe this year, maybe next year. Let's see when we get there. So I think they may have been deliberate by the Buddha to pass away in a small place. It kind of suits the Buddha's temperament, what kind of person he was. There wasn't anything about making anything big out of things, but keeping things small. This is one possibility here. Another possibility that why the Buddha passes away here could be that maybe he didn't know exactly when he was going to pass away here. Even though sometimes we have some idea when we're going to pass away, it may be difficult to time it exactly. Even for the Buddha, it's going to happen exactly there. So it may just be that he was traveling along. Maybe he was going back to his home, or the city where he spent most of his time at Savatthi. Maybe he was going to Kapilavatthu, where his relatives lived, or who knows. He was certainly traveling in that direction. If you know, you may not know the map of India, but if you do, you know it goes roughly that direction. So maybe that he just happens to die here. Just like most of us, we don't really know where we're going to die. Or when you die, you just die, and that wherever you happen to be. And that is another possibility. But of course, that possibility is not very palatable to many Buddhists, because it means that the Buddha wasn't really, he didn't know what was happening. He wasn't really in charge of events. And of course, the Buddhist idea, especially later generations of Buddhists, and this is something you see throughout the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, is that the Buddha is always in control of everything, all these supernatural things happening here. But in the early suttas, there's very little of that, as we have seen. The Buddha doesn't really display any kind of supernormal phenomena. This is usually a later development. And the same thing here, people trying to elevate the Buddha, whereas actually things were much more natural, perhaps. This is just my suggestion based on studying these things, on comparing the suttas, the various versions of these suttas, and then coming to that sort of conclusion. So I think that's a possibility as well. So anyway, these are the reasons I think the Buddha chose to pass away there, but that this wasn't really satisfactory, as I mentioned, to later generations. So later generations, what is happening now, of course, we get this story of a place that is supposed to have existed exactly where Kusinara existed, and this place, of course, turns out to be incredibly grand, far grander than any of the cities of ancient India. So it's not just that the reason why the Buddha didn't choose these other big cities in India wasn't because the reason actually was, according to this narrative you find here, that they weren't good enough for him. So he actually chose a place that was even better. This is kind of how this narrative functions. So Kusinara turns out to have been a far grander capital city in ancient India than any of these other towns. So the Buddha actually chooses something grander. In fact, this city is so grand that it is compared to the city of the gods, of the devas. In other words, it's like a godly status. And of course, that is kind of suitable for the Buddha, to die in a place that is grand enough for the gods, the greatest of the gods. That is sort of the idea behind this. And so I think that this passage we're going to see now, I think it is, again, it is very likely to have been added later on by people who wanted to elevate the Buddha, make something special out of his passing away. They weren't really satisfied with the Buddha passing away in the jungle. So I'm saying all of these things because it is important to remember that these suttas, they are historical documents. What the Buddha taught is one thing, and some of the suttas, especially like this one here, it is a narrative, it is a story that is told by later generations, and there's going to be things in there which are not 100% accurate to history, obviously, because it is a story and elements creep in which are not historically accurate. But the overall storyline, I think, is true, very likely to have happened in this way, because it is very consistent wherever you read it. So I just should maybe let you know as well, if you want to ask questions as we go along, please do so, if you think that I'm... Okay, so please, Ananda, yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, you go, yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I thought Buddha saw what was happening, and then with his psychic powers, and also the fact that this paragraph says that this was just like Alakamanda, the divine city. So I think he may have chosen with humbly. May I suggest that that he knew where he was heading, that he knew where he was going to pass away. So because if he was able to see that one of the second most senior disciple is nodding, just a minor thing like that, and then he came and gave, I think 7 or 8 ways of getting out of nodding while meditating. So may I very respectfully suggest Ajahn that he knew what he was doing.
No, you're right. There are certain cases in the suttas where the Buddha does things that are kind of supernormal and unusual. Absolutely, I think that's true. But very often they turn out to be not, on comparison with the parallel suttas, they turn out to be dubious. And even the one at Mahaparinibbana, I haven't actually looked at that sutta specifically, but you need to really check it against the parallels to know what is going on there. Did it really happen that way? And I know that in many cases it did not. And so for that reason, I'm always, I take this with a pinch of salt, all this supernormal. I'm not saying that the Buddha wasn't capable. He may very well have been capable of these things, but I don't think he displayed these things. Remember, there was a rule against the monastic, against displaying supernormal powers, and it's very likely the Buddha would have also followed that rule. He would not have kind of gone against that. It would have been setting a bad example for the rest of the monks if he did that. So I think it is unlikely, but I agree with you. It's possible. I'm not saying that this alternative version of the story is not necessary. It could be true. It is just this is my bias. My bias is leading me in that direction. This is the way I like to see things. I like to make things more natural. The whole thing about the Buddhist path, it is a natural path. There's a natural path about insight, a natural path about peace and understanding of things. This is kind of the whole direction of Buddhism. And once you start to make it too much supernormal, too much into these other things, I think you lose some of the beauty of Buddhism with the fact that it is a natural path. So, of course, the world is more mysterious than we sometimes know about. There's also things in the world that are hard to explain. For that reason, we should remain open to these things, and that's not really the point. The point is more that bring it back to earth, to 2 feet well planted on the ground, and we don't take off too much with these things. Yes, Annie? Yeah. This is Morris Walsh. The one I'm reading is Ajahn Sujato. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah, are you okay with that? Yeah. I'm doing it just to kind of make it more interesting. Yeah, to make it more difficult for everyone. So, yeah. Yeah, everyone okay? Yes? Okay. So, then we have this story of the Mahasudassana. Sudassana means like to see. Sudassana means someone who is good looking, and Maha is great. So the great, good looking one is basically what that means. And he was a wheel turning monarch. So this is the Dhammachakka Raja. And these were the great monarchs, mythological monarchs that kind of ruled everything, ruled the entire continents and all of that. And they lived and they ruled according to Dhamma. If they conquer the territory, it was always done righteously, with morally. They just kind of drove the army in there and they said, please, everyone, keep the 5 precepts. That's how they kind of conquer territory. Everyone said, sadhu, and then that territory was conquered. That's how it worked. Quite nice, isn't it? I like that way of conquering territories. They realized that the kings were really good kings. And so this story in the Pali is actually a separate sutta. So if you read the Digha Nikaya, these are the long discourses. The discourse that comes after this one is called the Mahasudassana Sutta. And it's another long sutta. And it has the whole story of what happens to this king. And everything is really absolutely marvelous and brilliant. Everything's like gold and gems and silver, and everything is just 84,000 of this, 84,000 of that, and everything is really over the top. And in some of the versions of this sutta, of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, they actually include the Mahasudassana Sutta in that. So this whole large exposition on all this marvelous city is actually part of that. But in the Pali, it's not. So why is that? And I think quite likely this sutta is also something that has probably been added into the sutta at a later time. And for this, in the Pali, all we have is this very kind of little paragraph that is there, maybe it was the original part of this, just to make it kind of acceptable for the Buddha to pass away there. But actually, it exists as a separate sutta elsewhere. So these are the small inconsistencies between the different versions of the suttas. So this is what it has to say. Once upon a time, there was a king named Mahasudassana, who was a wheel-turning monarch, a just and principled king. His dominion extended to all 4 sides, in other words, 4 directions. He achieved stability in the country and possessed the 7 treasures. These 7 treasures, they are like mythological treasures that this king had. It's like I'm not going to go into that now, but kind of a magical horse and a magical elephant and a magical jewel and that sort of thing. Yeah. His capital was this Kusinara, which at that time was named Kusavati. So even the name was similar here. It stretched for 12 leagues from east to west and 7 leagues from north to south. The royal capital of Kusavati was successful, prosperous, populous, full of people with plenty of food. It was just like Alakamanda, the royal capital of the gods, which is successful, prosperous, populous, full of spirits, and with plenty of food. Kusavati was never free of 10 sounds by day or night, namely the sound of elephants, of horses, of chariots, of drums, of clay drums, of arch harps, singing horns, gongs, handbells, and the cry, "Eat, drink, and be merry," as the 10th. So if you ever want to tell anyone to enjoy themselves, you can say, "Eat, drink, and be merry," and you can still be quoting from the suttas when you say that. That's kind of nice. So this is this marvelous capital, and you can see it was very vast. 12 leagues. A league is a yojana in Pali, and it is often calculated to be maybe around 15 kilometers or so. So 12 leagues would be 180 kilometers by 7, which is how much? That's about 105 or something. So it's a very, very large city that you're talking about. And of course, nothing like it in ancient India. And even if you look at the largest cities in the world today, they don't really quite measure up to this particular capital. It's really enormous. And it has all of these things, full of people, full of things. And so it is a kind of astonishing place. And so that is that story. If you want to read the full story of that one, again, go to Digha Nikaya 17, which has all the details of what this place is supposed to have been like. Anyway, so now we have established that this place is worthy for the Buddha to pass away. Yeah, it is not just a small village. It actually is a place of amazing, remarkable place. Okay, and then let's just carry on now. Go, Ananda, into Kusinara and inform the Mallas. The Mallas are the people of Kusinara. This very day, Vasettas, in the last watch of the night, the realized one will become fully extinguished. Come forth, Vasettas, come forth. Don't regret it later. The realized one became fully extinguished in our village district, but we didn't get a chance to see him in his final hour. Yes, sir, replied Ananda. Then he robed up, and taking his bowl and robe, he entered Kusinara with a companion. So here, now we are probably more on more solid historical ground, and this particular passage here occurs in all the versions of the sutta that I have consulted with. And the idea here, of course, is again this one of the things that you see with the Buddha towards the very end. He's very concerned about doing the right thing for all the people around him, to give them a last chance to hear the Dhamma, to give them a last chance to pay respects and say goodbye. And we've seen this before, and we see this here again. He's concerned about these Mallas. This Mallas is like a small republic which lived in this area, and this Mallan republic was probably subject to the larger kingdom of Kosala, just as the Sakyas were, the Buddha's relatives, part of this large kingdom. But they were an independent republic within that larger kingdom. And you can see here they're called Vasettas. They're called Vasettas because that was the clan name of those Mallas. Yeah, they all kind of had like a common clan name, and that was the Vasetta name. So the Buddha is concerned about them. Yeah, here he is, he's dying in their village, and he wants everyone to have a chance to say their final goodbye. It's very sweet, it's very kind of beautiful ending there. And it's just like, it's just a reminder how important it is to kind of do things in the right way. When someone passes away, to say your goodbyes in the right way, to make sure that you have a chance to kind of say those words that we sometimes forget to say. And then when someone has passed away, it's too late, can't do it anymore. So this is similar to that, a chance to ask for forgiveness if that is required, a chance to say, to wish them well, whatever happens after you pass away, and these kind of things. And this is probably what is going on here. So, so a nice little touch there again by the Buddha. And of course, once this has been done, this is exactly what happens. So this is what kind of comes up next then. So Ananda goes into the town, and he takes this a companion with him, which is the usual way that the monks would do things. And you will see, if you look at how monks and nuns travel even in the present day, it's usually with a companion, very, very common. Except for Ajahn Brahmali, he doesn't travel with a companion, but the vast majority of monks will travel with a companion. And I think it's probably taken out of the suttas, because this is how monastics traveled at that particular time. You have this word, interesting little word here of village district. Let's see what it says in the other one. I have it all here. What does it say over here? In our parish he has over there. Okay, parish, that's interesting. That's a very English idea. Church of England idea. But in the Pali word is actually Gama Ketta. Gama means village, and Ketta means field. And the idea there is that every village was kind of around the villages. You had a kind of a large number of fields. This was to feed the village. This was how they made their livelihood. And so the Gama Ketta is like one unit, one kind of unit in ancient Indian society that was self-sustaining. This was self-sustaining villages with the fields around them. And this is what this was about. This was kind of this self-sustaining unit that they came from. So, the Buddha is then staying in this park outside, as we saw before, Upavattana Park. We saw that before 4 months ago. And then Ananda goes into the town. So, now at that time, the Mallas of Kusinara were sitting together at the meeting hall on some business. Ananda went up to them and announced, "This very day, Vasettas, in the last watch of the night, the realized one will become fully extinguished. Come forth, Vasettas, come forth. don't regret it later, thinking the realized one became fully extinguished in our own village district, but we didn't get a chance to see him in his final hour. So there we have this word, final extinguishment, and the Pali for that is Parinibbana, and what does Maurice Walsh translate it as? He has, okay, where is it? Just final Nibbana it has over there. So again, this is a small but important point about the sutta, is that sometimes people don't translate certain Pali words. And here Maurice Walsh hasn't translated the word Nibbana. And that is always, I think it is ideal to try to translate these words, because in ancient India, these words would have a very obvious and clear meaning to the population. The word Nibbana wasn't just a spiritual word, it also had a meaning, and the meaning means like the going out of the flame. That is what Nibbana is. There's something going out, something becoming extinguished, quite literally. And for us to understand what these suttas are about, I think it's very important to translate these words. That's why I prefer Bhante Sujato's translation, where he calls it tonight will be the Blessed One's full extinguishment, because it actually makes it very clear what is going on. This is what the ancient Indians would have heard. They would have heard extinguishment, whereas what we don't hear at all we hear is Nibbana. And when we hear a word like Nibbana, you have no idea what it means, so you kind of put whatever ideas you want into that word. So by translating it, we're helping people to get some idea what these things actually refer to, and then we can discuss it based on that. Anyway, so he goes in and he tells them, he goes to the assembly hall. The assembly hall is called the Santagara, and this was one of those common things that they had in India at that time. These were like at the center of the villages and the towns, and these were halls where they would meet. And you may have heard sometimes, we talk about the kind of the political structures of ancient India, and one of the strange things about ancient India is that they seem to have had a democratic system that was just as ancient as the ancient Greek democratic system, maybe even more ancient. We don't really know exactly. And these Santagaras, they were places where they would meet and they would carry out business, in this way. And they were the places where they would then vote or decide, make decisions based on these democratic principles. So this is what the Santagara was. It was like a public meeting hall, and they had that from the very beginning, even in these villages in ancient India. They were used for all kind of public purposes, but one of them was to kind of do the business of the society at that time. Okay, when they heard what Ananda had to say, the Mallas, their sons, their daughter-in-laws, their wives became distraught, saddened and grief-stricken, and some with hair disheveled and arms raised, falling down like the feet were chopped off, rolling back and forth, lamented. Too soon the Blessed One became fully extinguished. Too soon the Holy One, the Sugato, will become fully extinguished. Too soon the seer will vanish from the world. So this is a kind of a typical passage that we see in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, this kind of idea of grieving. And you can see here there were really good grievers in ancient India. They really go for it. They rolling back and forth on the ground, falling down like the feet were chopped off. They really know how to do this properly. No messing around. And so this is a kind of the point. But if you look at some of the other versions of the sutta, I looked up the version from the Sarvastivadin, which is another lineage of Buddhism. It doesn't have this passage at all. That is, something which was kind of added, it seems, when it was suitable, deemed appropriate. So it was like a stereotypical passage on how grieving happened when it really happened properly. And then we have this beautiful synonyms here for the Buddha. The Blessed One, which is the Bhagava, like the Lord. The Sugato literally means well gone, someone who has arrived at the good destination. You could maybe say that someone who is fully happy or something like that. the well-gone one. And the last one, which is, I think, the very meaningful one, the idea that he's the seer. Another way to translate that is to call him the eye of the world. Yeah, this is such a meaningful thing, because the whole idea of Buddhism, how Buddhism works, is the idea that the Buddha arises, he sees the truth of existence, the truth, the reality of things, and then he passes it on to other people. And the reason why this is so important is that because seeing the truth is very difficult, and it takes very special circumstances for a person to wake up to that truth. And of course, being a disciple, getting those teachings on the plate is much easier than having to discover everything for yourself. Even when you get them given to you by somebody else, still it is hard enough. Yeah, it is not that easy to become an arahant. If it was that easy, there'd be lots of arahants in the world. But whenever I ask the assembly, assemble people, how many people are arahants in the assembly, you don't get that many raised arms. Yeah, and that is because it is not that simple. Even when you're given the path on the plate, still it is difficult. So this is what is so significant about the Buddha, is that he's able to make this breakthrough on his own, through causes and conditions coming together, living in an ancient spiritual community that supports this kind of practice, enables this kind of practice, and then having the right qualities, obviously is very important. So he had the right qualities before. Yeah, he probably had very good samadhi, deep meditation, from quite likely from a previous life. That's why when he was a child, he went into deep samadhi, according to the story. So all of these things coming together. But he's the eye of the world. He's the one that makes it possible for the rest of us to practice. This is a very significant part of these teachings. It opens up this possibility here. So, anyway, there's quite a lot of repetition in the sutta. We've seen some of these things before, but I thought it might be nice to just to repeat it a little bit. Then the Mallas, their sons, their daughter-in-laws and wives, distraught, saddened and grief-stricken, went to the Malian Salgrove, the Upavatana, and approached Ananda. Then Ananda thought, if I have the Mallas pay homage to the Buddha one by one, they won't be finished before first light. And the Buddha is supposed to die in the night, so it's going to be too late. I'd better separate them family by family and then have them pay homage, saying, Sir, the Malla named so-and-so with children, wives, retinue. Whatever. Servants and friends. Yeah, but Ajahn Suddhata has a retinue and ministers, which is a bit strange. Minister doesn't really work. Servants and friends is better, like you have over there. They bow with his head at your feet, and so that's what he did. So you can see here how Venerable Ananda is acting as the guardian of the Buddha. He's doing the job of the Upataka, making sure that everyone does the right thing. He knows what is appropriate, and this is kind of one of the wonders of Ananda, that he always knows what is appropriate, apparently. So he does that. And here you get some idea of the structure, again, of society in ancient India. How you would have then, at that time, you would have kind of the man who was like the head of the family. That was much more prevalent, much stronger in that ancient culture than it probably is in modern society, at least in most parts of the world. And that would often be a very extended family. Yeah, so you have his wife, or maybe many wives, and then you have the children. And then you will have the retinue, and this retinue would be all the people who worked for that household. Could often be large number of people, because they had to plow the fields, they had to look after the business, whatever it was, and it could often be large kind of units. And this kind of grouping, this is the establishment, if you like, of the ancient Indian societies. They are called Gahapati. And a Gahapati, a Gaha is a house, and Pati is like a lord, or the boss of the house, if you like. So the Gahapatis, they are the kind of the establishment in ancient Indian society. And these were the ones who were part of the democratic process. These are the ones who went to the halls, and kind of voted. Whereas everyone else, they weren't really considered, they couldn't really take part in these things. So in that case, again, it is a bit similar to kind of the way of the Greeks, the way the Greek democracy worked, that whereby only the certain part of the establishment of the Greek society actually were allowed to vote, whereas the rest, they kind of had to, hope that they would make good decisions on their behalf, otherwise they would suffer. And it was very similar in ancient Indian society. And maybe there was, I wonder if there was some kind of crossover there, some kind of information going maybe, how these things were to be done. Because it is very interesting. You look at the history of trade and these things. We know that there was trade going along the Silk Route going back thousands of years, and there would have been information being spread around. The world is often much smaller than we think it is. We think that the world is kind of split up, especially in ancient times, into very separate units. But actually, there's much more information going across than we sometimes think. And there were trade routes with boats going already at this time. So there may very well have been information being passed around between Greece and India. And we know that there were, one of the things that unified this particular part of the world was the Persian Empire. This was a time when the Persian Empire was very strong. And the Persian Empire goes back to 7th century BC, so we're talking about a couple of hundred years at least prior to this. And the Persian Empire went all the way into India, a time they were fighting with the Indians, all the way down to the Indus Valley. The Indus Valley is a lot west of where we are now, but it was still in the Indian sphere, the cultural sphere of India. Even though India was very large, India was like a cultural sphere where the language was approximately the same, and the kind of the way they were was very similar. There was a large cultural sphere. But once you step beyond that, you got into Persian Empire, and that was a different cultural sphere. So the Persian Empire was a meeting place for all these various countries. Because the Persian Empire was so powerful, they had warriors from around, they had captured people from various places. So previously they had warred with the Greeks, so they had many Greek mercenaries sometimes in their army, or captured soldiers, whatever it is. And because they had also been at war with the Indians, they also had captured Indians and had Indian mercenaries as well, or even cooperated with the Indians to fight the Greeks or whatever. And of course the ancient Persian capital was called Persepolis. Polis is the old Greek word for city, like Naples, Neapolis, new city, and Persepolis was the capital of the Persians. And it was a very cosmopolitan place where all these people from the various sides of the world, they would meet together. And it's fairly well known that this is where the Indians and the Greeks would actually meet in this way because of this large Persian Empire. So this is interesting because it shows you that ideas are very likely to have crossed over between these various cultures that existed at this time. I hope you don't mind a little bit of history because I find this fascinating. It puts all of these things in context. It makes it easy to understand the suttas when we know where different ideas could have come from. And there's a slightly different angle on these suttas that we normally talk about when we talk just about the doctrine or the teaching of the Buddha. Okay, so these were then the family units, and this is how they worked, and they would then be like a household, if you like, but a very extended household compared to what we have these days. That's what he did. And so by this means, Ananda got the Mallas to finish paying homage to the Buddha in the first watch of the night. The night was divided into 3 parts, 3 watches, each of about 4 hours. And this was the first watch of the night. The Buddha was supposed to pass away in the middle watch of the night. And it is quite likely that the Buddha would have also given them some talk. He would have given them a talk about things. They might have asked questions. They may have wanted to ask forgiveness and all of these kind of things. In fact, according to some of the parallel versions of the suttas, the Buddha actually did give a talk. And he talked to them, and he probably would have summarized his teachings and told people what was the essence, what they should be doing after he passed away, and all of that. So this is what happens. And of course, the Mallas would then feel a sense of fulfillment, that they had a chance to see the Buddha before he passed away. Otherwise, things can seem very empty. Suddenly, this incredibly important person is gone and no chance to say goodbye. This would have been presumably a very fulfilling thing to happen here. Okay, Now we come to the next little episode, and this is has more to do with the Buddha's teachings, and this is a famous episode of Subhadda. And just for your information, Subhadda, this word Buddha often means like fortunate. So Su isn't like an intensifier. This means the very fortunate one. I don't think there is a coincidence that he has in his name, because he is kind of very fortunate, and you will see what happens in a second here. Now, at that time, a wanderer named Subhadda was residing near Kusinara. He heard that on that very day, in the last watch of the night, the ascetic Gautama would become fully extinguished. He thought, I have heard from the Brahmins of the past who were elderly and senior, the teachers of teachers, and they said, only rarely do the realized ones, in other words the Buddhas, arise in the world, perfected ones and fully awakened Buddhas. On this very day, in the last watch of the night, the ascetic Gautama will become fully extinguished. This state of uncertainty has come up in me. I am quite confident that the Buddha is capable of teaching me that I can give up this state of uncertainty. This is the kind of the idea here. The idea here is that India has always been a very religious society, and the idea of people who are enlightened or awakened has always been part of that culture, going back into the deep recesses of history. That's what you see here. And so people know about this and are always looking out for teachers to guide them on the path. And so he has something he's unsure about, and he wants to find a teacher. This is why we find teachers in the world, because we are uncertain about things. That is just as true on the spiritual path as it is anywhere else. Then Subhadda went to the Malayan sal grove at Upavatana, approached Ananda and said to him, Master Ananda, I have heard that the Brahmins of the past who were elderly and senior, the teachers of teachers, they said, only rarely do realized ones arise in the world, perfected ones, fully awakened Buddhas. On this very day, in the last watch of the night, the ascetic Gautama, that's the Buddha, the ascetic Gautama is the Buddha, will become fully extinguished. This state of uncertainty has come up in me. I'm quite confident that the Buddha is capable of teaching me that I can give up this state of uncertainty. Master Ananda, please let me see the Buddha. So you wonder what this ascetic Gautama is all about, and that is what the people who were not Buddhist, what they would call the Buddha. Ascetic samana. This is kind of the big ancient tradition in India where people would go forth from the ordinary life and become ascetics. The famous samana movement, a big, like religious movement, if you want to call it religion, that existed in India at that time. And Gautama is the family name of the Buddha. And people who were not Buddhist, they would call him that, because they couldn't really call him, master or lord or anything like that yet, because they didn't really know who he was. So they called him that. That was a standard appellation. And then what happened? When he had spoken, Ananda said, Enough, Reverend Subhadda, do not trouble the realized one. He is tired. For a second time and a third time, Subhadda asked Ananda, and the third time, Ananda refused. So you can see here again, Ananda is the kind of the gatekeeper. He is the good upatak. His job is to look after the Buddha. The Buddha is about to pass away, maybe in a few hours' time, very, very close to his passing away. He's about to die. And of course, you don't want to kind of get all kind of strangers kind of coming into your room when you're about to pass away. I don't know how you would feel if you had all this, you were lying on your bed about to die and all these strangers came to visit you and asked you for some last advice. It might not feel like the right time. That's probably what Ananda feels here. Just leave the Buddha alone. He is tired. Kilanto. And again, this brings us back to the natural side of this Dhamma, that the Buddha too was tired towards the end, and he didn't have much energy. It's one of those things that we have seen throughout this Mahaparinibbana Sutta. The body is failing, the body is falling apart. He has no energy anymore, and you can see how obviously the end is getting very close. So Ananda is doing his job, but in this case he gets it slightly wrong. Yeah, and this is why this person is called the very fortunate one. Yeah, we'll see now why he is so fortunate. The Buddha heard that discussion between Ananda and Subhadda, and he said to Ananda, "Enough, Ananda, don't obstruct Subhadda. Let him see the realized one. For whatever he asks me, he will only be looking for understanding, not trouble, and he will quickly understand any answer I give to his question." So Ananda said to Venerable Subhadda, to the wanderer Subhadda, "Go, Reverend Subhadda, the Buddha is taking the time for you." So usually Ananda is very sharp, he knows the right thing to do, but here he gets it slightly wrong. And I think here he has perhaps forgotten what the purpose of the Buddha is in the world. And of course the purpose of a Buddha, and this is the only reason why a Buddha is around, why he lives, and why he does what he does, is because he lives out of compassion for the world, to teach them his discovery, to teach him where real happiness is to be found, how to get out of suffering. That's the purpose of the Buddha's life, and he doesn't have any purpose beyond that. He has finished what he has to do. He doesn't have anything more to be done in his life. He only lives for others. It's a very powerful thing, just to live for others. You don't live for anything else. For the Buddha, it would have been far better just to go into a cave somewhere and bliss out in jhana states and other states of supreme awakening. But instead, he spends his whole life, and often with trouble, often with people wanting to argue with him. There are examples in the suttas of people who were kind of masters of kind of nitpicking and discussion. Maybe the kind of politicians of the day, they were something like that, they were loving just discussing things and not really discussing to listen, because that's not what politics is about. Politics is often about kind of beating the opposition, and this was a bit like that. You go to argue with the Buddha not because you want to listen, but because you want to beat maybe the opposition. It was about winning arguments, and India was full of these people who traveled around, met up with others, and then they would argue in public, and then there would be a victor from that argument. And you can imagine it wouldn't necessarily be very pleasant. So the right way, if you want to ask a question on the Dhamma, is not to ask a question because you want to argue. The point is to ask a question because you have something real that you want to figure out. You want to understand something. And most people are very good with that, but there's always some people who just love arguing for argument's sake. And if you are a teacher, like Ajahn Brahmali, who has to meet so many people, it's very exhausting when somebody's there just to argue with you, because then there is no answer. There's no answer you can give, because they will always argue back and kind of whatever. There is no end to those kind of discussions. But this is an important point to keep in mind for everyone, especially those who tend to be a bit more argumentative, that ask questions only because you want to find out. Don't exhaust the teacher. A teacher only has so much energy. And this is the right way of asking questions. And then you feel when you have reached kind of the right point, and then you stop asking further because you know that now it is not going any further. So it's an important point to have that kind of right relationship between a teacher and someone who is more like a student, if you like. Okay, but because the Buddha's job is only to teach, that is what his life is all about, then there is no reason why the Buddha, even towards the very end, should obstruct somebody. If somebody is genuinely interested in the Dhamma, if they want to hear what the Buddha has to teach, the Buddha is always open. To his very last breath, he will teach. He kind of draws in his last breath and says something. And that's exactly what we will see later on, how the Buddha gives his very last teaching, and straight away after that he dies, because then there is no point anymore. He has done what he has to do. So Subhadda, the very fortunate one, who gets this last chance. So then the wanderer Subhadda went up to the Buddha, exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he sat down to one side and said to the Buddha, "Master Gautama, there are those ascetics and Brahmins who lead an order and a community and teach a community. They are well-known and famous religious founder, regarded as holy by many people. Namely, Purana Kassapa, Makkali Gosala, Niganta Nataputta, Sanjaya Balatiputta, Pakkuda Kachayana, and Ajita Kesakambala. These are the 6 famous kind of leaders of religious sects in ancient India. And there are some remnants of their teachings are still found in the suttas. So maybe later on we can have a look at one of the suttas where their teachings are talked about. And it's interesting to look at that great variety of teachings in ancient India. Some of them were materialists, in the sense that when you die everything is over. Some had the idea of fate, that when there was this fate carrying it, kind of, you just had to go with the flow until fate took you to the end, and there were all kind of strange teachings. And one of these here, the Niganta Nataputta, the last one, he was the leader of the Jains. And of course the Jains, they still exist in the world today. You go to India, you still find Jain ascetics in India today. So all of this is very interesting, because it ties up these documents, ancient Buddhist documents, with contemporary society here. And we can see how these are historical documents, precisely because of that tying up with contemporary society here. Fascinating that it's like going back in history. You can see it's still there, that there's a clear connection there between ancient history and how things are now, which is nice, because it gives you the feeling that these actually are historical documents. This is one of the purpose of reading suttas like this. So these were all well-known leaders, and if you were an ordinary person, you had to try to negotiate this. Where should we go? Who should be my teacher? It's a bit like in the modern situation. You are faced with kind of so many different teachers, so many different religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, I don't know, all this kind of New Age teachings, Taoism, Buddhism. Who is right among all these? Is there a creator God or is there not a creator God? Buddhists say there is no creator God. Some of these other teachings say there is a creator God. Who is right? I'm confused. It's a very similar thing like as today. Today we live again in a very multicultural society, in the sense that we have access to all of these teachings. And it's hard to pick out. So how do we pick out? So it's a very relevant kind of question here, for us as well, for everyone here. So, and this was exactly his question. Well, how do I know which ones of these have got their act together? Which ones of these are awakened? How do we find out? So actually, this is quite interesting here. So, then it says here, according to their own claims, did all of them have direct knowledge, or none of them, or only some? This could be translated better, I think. I shouldn't criticize Ajahn Sujato straight away, but I think here it should be better be translated as, did all of them have direct knowledge as they claimed? That would be a better translation of this. Have they realized? So, right. So this is what Maurice Walsh has. He has more like that. That is actually, I think, a preferable way of translating this. So are they all awakened as they claim, or are only some of them awakened, or are none of them awakened? This is the question. These leaders, in other words, how do I choose? Who should I choose? And then comes this famous answer by the Buddha, how to decide. This is it's an interesting exercise in how to do these things in the right way. Because you can't, if you're the Buddha, you can't yet really say, I am awakened, all the other ones just talk nonsense. If you say that, people are going to be put off. Even though it might be true, you have to negotiate these things in a way which is wise, where people can make up their own opinion on their own account, and using their own kind of wisdom and faculties. So the Buddha says, instead, it says, enough, Subhadda, let that be. I shall teach you the Dhamma. Listen and pay close attention. I will speak. Yes, sir, Subhadda replied. And the Buddha said this, Subhadda, in whatever teaching and training the Noble Eightfold Path is found, is not found. There is no true ascetic, no second ascetic, no third ascetic, no fourth ascetic. In whatever teaching and training the Noble Eightfold Path is found, there you find the true ascetic, the true second ascetic, the third ascetic, and the fourth ascetic. And the idea here is that if there is such a thing as awakening, when the Buddha talks about the true ascetic here, what he is referring to is the noble people, the people who have practiced this path, who have had some deep insight into the nature of reality. In Buddhism, we divide this up into 4 grades. The stream enter, the first stage of awakening. Then we have the once returner who comes back to this world once. And you have the non-returner who gets reborn in a very high kind of like a deep meditation realm. And then the fully awakened arahant, which is the Buddha is an example of. You have these 4 stages. And so these are the 4 ascetics. These are the people who have real insight into the Buddha's teachings. So the Buddha, what he says here is simply that, well, if you practice in the right way, then you get to these things. That's when you get these results. It doesn't matter whether you call yourself a Buddhist or not. You can call yourself whatever you like. It doesn't matter. If you practice these things, then you're going to get these results. That is such a beautiful thing. It is not it is not us against them. It is not about being a Buddhist or not being Buddhist, belonging to the Buddhist family or whatever. It is about what you practice, how you live your life. That is what it comes down to. So, and this is why Buddhism is kind of considered in many ways like a universal religion. It is not a religion or teaching which is kind of just, you belong to the Christian community or whatever it is, but it's something which applies to everybody. If a Christian practiced this Noble Eightfold Path, they too would have the same results. Just because you call yourself Christian doesn't mean you can't practice this. If you are, whatever you are, even if you worship Thor or Odin, these are my ancient gods from Norway. I'm being Norwegian. I never worshipped these gods, but 1,000 years ago they worshipped these gods in Norway. If you worship anything, it's kind of irrelevant. What matters is how you practice. And this is again one of those things that makes the Buddhist teaching so reasonable. You're feeling that you're dealing with universal principles, rather than dealing with a sect and narrow kind of way of looking at things. And this is what the Buddha is saying. Of course, this path is difficult for practicing if you are a Christian, for example, because it implies, for example, that you can't really have a permanent God. And if you can't have a permanent God, it's difficult to really be a Christian, perhaps. Perhaps, I don't know, but you might think so. So the path implies a few things that makes it more likely for some people to succeed than others. Nevertheless, it is a path. That is what it is all about. And so the Buddha says this to Subhadda, and then that becomes then the basis then for Subhadda to make up his mind. So, and then the Buddha adds here, he says that in this teaching and training, in this Dhamma and Vinaya, the Noble Eightfold Path is found. And then he says, only here is there a true ascetic, here a second ascetic, here a third ascetic, here a fourth ascetic. Other sects are empty of ascetics, he says there. So that is, there he is kind of making a claim which goes a bit beyond what I just mentioned before, because here he's kind of saying that these ascetics are found within the Buddhist teachings, and which may be true. But I think the main point there is the first two things. The fact that wherever the Noble Eightfold Path is found, there you find these people. It may very well be the case that at that particular time it was only found within Buddhism. It wasn't known as Buddhism, of course. Then it was just known as the Buddha's Dhamma or whatever. And so that is how you kind of how you make someone see and someone kind of come across, is you teach in a way which is kind of universal. You teach about things that kind of make sense to people, and then they gradually come across in this way. This is kind of how the Buddha goes about things. It's a very, very nice way of teaching the Dhamma. And then the Buddha says, were these mendicants to practice well, the world would not be empty of perfected ones. Arahants, it says in your translation there, arahants and perfected ones, that's the same word. And of course the point is that if all these monks, or nuns or lay people, if they practice in the right way, then the results will come as a consequence. And then you have arahants in the world. That's the kind of the result of the Noble Eightfold Path are the arahants. And then you have a little verse coming in between here. I was 29 years of age, Subhadda, when I went forth to discover what is skillful. It's been over 50 years since I went forth, and I am the one who points out the proper teaching. Outside of here, there is no true ascetic. Were these mendicants to practice well, the world would not be emptied of perfected ones. When he had spoken, Subhadda said to the Buddha, "Excellent, sir, excellent," as if he were writing the overturned or revealing the hidden or pointing out the path to the lost or lighting a lamp in the dark so people with good eyes can see what's there. So the Buddha has made the teaching clear in many ways. I go for refuge to the Buddha, to the teaching, and to the mendicant Sangha, the monastic Sangha. Sir, may I receive the going forth and the ordination in the Buddha's presence. So he has obviously taken the Buddha as his teacher after that teaching. And this is the standard passage again on what happens when someone is kind of convinced of the teaching. They say that, wow, someone has really turned up the light and now I see what's going on. This is what happens. And at this point it's quite interesting again to compare what happens right here with these other versions of the sutta. And when I say other versions, again, what I mean is the versions of different schools of Buddhism, schools that have died out a long time ago, but that we still have the scriptures from these schools. And there's two versions in particular which I am able to consult with, and that is the Sarvastivadin school and the Dharmaguptaka school from ancient India. And when you compare it to this, it's quite different at this particular point. Because in both of these other ones, at this point, Subhadda, he doesn't just become a follower of the Buddha, he becomes a stream enter. Yeah, he becomes, all he has heard is this teaching on, the Noble Eightfold Path is the best path, and then you become a stream enter. Does that make sense? It's a bit, I don't know, maybe if he had heard teachings of the Buddha before, and now he kind of got that solidified, maybe it would make sense, but that particular teaching is not really a teaching, this particular one, which makes you see the truth. You can't just see the truth just by being told that the Noble Eightfold Path takes you to awakening, because there's not much content to it. It doesn't really say anything about how to look at the life, it doesn't say anything about meditation practice, it doesn't say anything about any of these things. So it's a bit suspect in my mind. Sometimes weird things happen, but it's a bit suspect. But then what happens is that then Subhadda, he gets the ordination in the Buddha's presence, he's a stream enterer, and then he goes off into the forest, and he practices in the forest, and then when he practices in the forest, he becomes an arahant, a perfected one. He reaches the very end of the path. And then when he has become the perfected one, he looks at his watch. No, he doesn't look at his watch. And he kind of thinks, wait, the Buddha is about to pass away here. Yeah. All of this happens in the meantime. The Buddha is only a few hours from passing away at this point. He has to become an arahant. Wait a minute, I should take full parinibbana. I should become extinguished before the Buddha. That would be appropriate. The Buddha is my teacher. And then he goes off and he kind of reaches a final extinguishment. All of this before the Buddha has passed away here. And this is where I think, yeah, maybe, but probably not. And this is where the suttas of this kind, they become, again, exaggerated. They become more like a hagiography of the Buddha, of these marvelous disciples, Subhadda, the super lucky one, the very lucky one. And they become more hagiographical nature, where it's more about boosting the name of the Buddha than actually to see what really happened. And in this case, the Pali version is much more reasonable. According to the Pali version, we will see that in a second. Yes, he now becomes a monastic, and then he goes off and he practices, and eventually he becomes an arahant. But everything doesn't happen before the Buddha passes away, because that is, it seems kind of, it is really a bit over the top, that whole story here. So again, this is an important point, just to show that sometimes these narratives, these histories, they need to be taken with a pinch of salt, and we need to kind of evaluate them properly or carefully before we accept what is actually going on here. So he says, "May I receive the going forth, the ordination in the Buddha's presence." Subhadda, if someone formally ordained in another sect wishes to take the going forth, the ordination in this teaching and training, they must spend 4 months on probation. When 4 months have passed, if the mendicants are satisfied, they'll give the going forth, the ordination into monkhood. However, I have recognized individual differences in this matter. And then he replies, Sir, if 4 months probation are required in such a case, I will spend 4 years on probation. When 4 years are passed, if the mendicants are satisfied, let them give me the going forth, the ordination into monkhood. And so the point of this is just the idea that if you come from another sect, very often you may have very strong views about things, and you want to test someone out, before you take someone on board as a Buddhist monastic. Because as a Buddhist monastic, you really have to have your views, they have to be aligned with how the views of Buddhism or the views of the Buddha. You can't just have all kind of random views about the world. You should ideally have some idea of the concept of rebirth and karma and these sort of things. So people need to be tested out. And we follow that principle to the present day, at least at Bodhinyana Monastery we do. So when someone comes to our monastery, they have to be an anagarika, a homeless one in white for a year, then they have to be a novice monk for another year, and only then can they become a fully ordained monk. And the idea is just to test people out, to see if they are ready for the monastic life. Because very often our ideas of the world will be very difficult to give up, and they will be contrary to the Buddha's teachings. And this is exactly the same thing that we see here with this Subhadda, they have to be tested out. And then he says, well, if 4 months are required, I will do it for 4 years. And of course the point is, he shows his enthusiasm. He shows that he is willing to go through a lot to be able to ordain as a Buddhist monk. This is kind of the idea here. So it's just this enthusiasm about the path. Whatever it takes, I will do it. That's basically what he's saying here. Yes?
In this translation, it says at the end of the 4 months, those monks who are established in mind. Are they Aryans, referring to those who have attained any stage, or just attaining jhanas? Or it says those monks who are established in mind.
Okay, which paragraph is it?
Which is at the end of 4 months. Those monks who are established in mind may let him go forth and give him ordination to the status of a mind. That word, established in mind, what is the Pali?
Okay, there we are. Okay, 529. Okay, yes. What is the Pali for that? This is aradha citta. Okay, this is the word aradha citta. Aradha. It means something like they are confident, or they are satisfied in mind. That's what I mean. That's basically Ajahn Suddhata has translated as satisfied, which I think is a much better translation.
About the novice person's behavior?
Sorry?
Satisfied about themselves? Or
satisfied about the person who wants to ordain. So they watch him or they watch her, and they make sure that they have the right ideas, and they're practicing in the right way. This is actually laid out in the Vinaya. It's very interesting. In the Vinaya Pitaka, you find this whole story behind this. And it talks about how you're supposed to look at somebody, they come to ordain, and you say, okay, be on probation for 4 months. And it tells you should look at them to see if they are behaving in certain ways, and if they are, then they can become monastics. So you have to satisfy the Sangha, So you're on probation, you're kind of walking on eggshells. And so that is kind of the point behind this. So, and then what happens next is, then the Buddha said to Ananda, well then Ananda, give Subhadda the going forth. Yes sir, Ananda replied. Then Subhadda said to Ananda, you are so fortunate, Reverend Ananda, so very fortunate to be anointed here in the teacher's presence as his pupil. And the wanderer Subhadda received the going forth and the ordination in the Buddha's presence. So this is just the idea here is just the idea that he is really excited about Buddhism. Yeah, just like many people when they come to Buddhism at the beginning, they're really excited about these teachings. I was very excited about Buddhism when I started out. I'm still excited by it, but in a bit more peaceful way than I was when I started out. And so he's excited and says to Venerable Ananda, "Wow, you are so lucky! Yeah, jeepers, you have got this, part of this wonderful teaching." He has realized there's something really special going on here, and he probably feels very lucky himself that he has kind of come to this particular point. This is really what this little thing is about. And then he receives the going forth, and the full ordination, precisely because the Buddha, he says before that he recognizes the individual differences. So he has certain people who have the ability to go forth straight away if something is pressing. And of course here it is a little bit pressing because the Buddha is about to pass away. That's probably why he does that. Then, not long after his ordination, Venerable Subhadda, living alone, withdrawn, diligent, keen and resolute, soon realized the supreme end of the spiritual path in this very life. He lived, having achieved with his own insight the goal for which gentlemen rightly go forth from the lay life into homelessness. This is Ajahn Sudato's translation of what? Of Kulaputta. Okay, Kulaputta. Yeah, it's not too unreasonable. Anyway, and he understood rebirth is ended. The spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done has been done. There is no return to any state of existence. And Venerable Subhadda became one of the perfected ones. He was the last personal disciple of the Buddha, of the Lord, it says over here. So there you have the kind of standard explanation of someone becoming fully enlightened. This is kind of standard thing you see throughout the suttas. And the only difference here is this idea of gentleman. This is Ajahn Sudato's translation. And Kulaputta, Kula is a clan. So these are what I talked about before, these extended families in ancient India that were kind of the establishment of society. And if you belong to a clan like that, and if you were like one of the main son, usually the son, of a family like that, it means that you were kind of part of that establishment because you were going to take over that household later on with the business or whatever it is that they had. And these, because they were the establishment in society, they were perhaps a little bit like what you might call a gentleman, maybe. I don't know. It's a little bit old-fashioned, but it's not entirely wrong the way this is translated here. So that is, it sort of makes sense. So, and you will notice here this interesting sequence of terms that you see throughout the suttas. When someone is practicing properly, it is always usually the same sequence. It varies a little bit, where it is living alone, withdrawn, diligent, keen, and resolute. And it's similar here in the one you have there: alone, secluded, unwearying, zealous, and resolute. So similar. And of course, this is just the idea of what you have to do to be able to succeed on the spiritual path fully, all the way to arahantship. And you will notice there the idea of seclusion is very important in Buddhism. If you want to take your meditation a step deeper, and it's good sometimes to have a little bit of seclusion every now and again. Come down to Jhana Grove or do something more secluded where you have a bit more time on your own, because that is where you kind of withdraw into yourself. You're not really in touch with the world so much anymore. Always we have the world that's kind of bombarding us with things. But when you withdraw into seclusion, that is where meditation can happen, because meditation is an inner thing. You have to be able to kind of end your sense contact with the world. That is where deep meditation happens. So seclusion is this very important thing, and when you start to look for it, like a passage like here, you find it so many places in the suttas. Eko, vupakato, seclusion, apamato, translated here as diligent, but you could also translate as heedful, in the sense you have to be careful, you have to be circumspect. That is a very important part of this practice. You can't just practice blindly, you have to reflect on what you're doing and always be circumspect. This is one of the things that makes this path so challenging in a sense. That it's not just, it's not just a recipe that you follow blindly for making bread or whatever. It is a recipe that you have to think of carefully to kind of create something to make this work properly here. And then you have to be keen and resolute, and this just says that you have to do this with energy and etc. Otherwise it doesn't work out. So very important little words to remind us what this path is about. Okay, so that was the last personal disciple of the Buddha. Now we are coming very, very close to the Buddha's passing away here. Shall I go till 4:30? Is that okay? Are you able to? Yeah, okay. So we'll go a little bit longer here. If you need to go, please feel free to go at any time. Now we come to the Buddha's last words. Then the Buddha addressed Venerable Ananda. Now, Ananda, some of you might think the teacher's dispensation has passed. Now we have no teacher. But you should not see it like this. The teaching and training, this is the Dhamma and Vinaya, that I have taught and pointed out for you, shall be your teacher after my passing. And this is a kind of statement that we have seen already on a number of occasions in this Mahaparinibbana Sutta, and it's one of those incredibly important statements, because here the Buddha says, how should we live after the Buddha passes away? What is the right attitude to the Dhamma, to these teachings? And you will notice here, that, and this is not just here, but earlier on, he specifically says that there shouldn't be someone who takes over. This is not like a corporation that has a CEO, yeah? There's no CEO in Buddhism. He specifically says there is no CEO. It's a decentralized organization where every Buddhist center runs its own affairs. Every monastery runs its own affairs. And your teacher is not some kind of guru that you take on. Your teacher, your ultimate teacher, is the Dhamma and Vinaya, these teachings of the Buddha. And what is so marvelous, and this is kind of what, this is why it is so important, this idea that we still have available the Buddha's teachings to the present day. This is kind of hard to grasp because it's 2,500 years since the Buddha passed away. But if you look at the history of these texts, if you look at the various studies that have been done, if you read a book called The Authenticity of the Early Buddhist Texts, I wrote that in part, so I really recommend that book. So it's a nice. It's actually I think it's quite nice, and it's very comprehensive. You don't find anything quite like it probably anywhere else, and it's especially for those of you who are kind of been Buddhist for a long time and interested in these things. It's quite nice, and it's also available on the net. You don't have to pay anything for it or anything like that. But the point is that we know, with a fairly high degree of certainty, I would say, that the teachings that we have now, I would say with a very high degree of certainty, are essentially the teachings of the Buddha after 2,500 years. And that means, because we know that, it means we can apply this principle. We can actually take the Buddha, the Dhamma, his teachings as our teacher. We don't have to look for gurus. We don't have to look for... Well, we can have other teachers as well. You can take Ajahn Brahmali as your teacher, of course. That's not the point. The point is that this is the final teaching. This is what stands behind everything else. This is the final reference for what is the real Buddhism or not. So if you have another teacher, they should always match with the word of the Buddha. If it doesn't match with the word of the Buddha, there is a problem. And this is so beautiful. It is very powerful and beautiful, because if we rely on ordinary people for teachings or whatever, we can never really be sure. The teacher may say all kind of strange things, and you kind of have to shrug your shoulders because you haven't got any reference. You haven't got any point where you can go and ask yourself whether these teachings are right or not. And it's much easier to get into unfortunate kind of relationships between teacher and student, where it can even sometimes become abusive. And it is astonishing how much abusive relationships you find within teachers and students, even in the Buddhist world. You don't have to look very far on the internet to find these things happen. They happen on a regular basis. Of course, the Buddhist world is quite a large world, but nevertheless, these things happen all the time. And they tend to happen because the teacher gets elevated into a guru, and whatever the guru says, well, you have to kind of go along. That's dangerous. Yeah, that is where you can end up with abusive relationships. But if the guru is not the final teacher, if the Dhamma of the Buddha is a final teacher, it releases us from that dependence on individuals. And our idea of Buddhism is much larger. It's a very, very important thing to remember. And it's a very big problem in the Buddhist world, not just in all kinds of Buddhism. It's a very big problem that people tend to take individuals as their teachers rather than the word of the Buddha. You get what is called the Acharya Vada. Acharya means teacher, Vada is doctrine. You follow the doctrine of the teacher rather than the doctrine of the Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha. And this becomes very problematic because you become so dependent on that teacher. So this is actually it may seem innocuous. You read this, you may think there's not much point, nothing kind of wonderful and amazing about it, but actually it's one of those very foundational things about Buddhism that makes it very different and makes it very wholesome and not subject to so much abuse and problems that you can often have if you live these things in the right way. So this is why it is useful to go back to the word of the Buddha, to really find out what he says. And this is why these sutta classes can be useful, because it draws you closer to the word of the Buddha. And eventually you gain enough insight that you can do some of these readings on your own as well. That's when often it becomes even more powerful. So remember that. This is where the true teachings are found. And this is where we should go to find final inspiration and final understanding of what is real Buddhism. Okay, let's go on to the next one here. After my passing, the mendicants, the monastics, ought not to address each other as reverend. Reverend here is avuso in Pali. It's a friendly term, as they do today. It's a term of friendship, of equality. So people call each other avuso back and forth. It's a bit sometimes translated as friend rather than as reverend. Actually, that's exactly what it is on this one, as friend. A more senior mendicant ought to address a more junior mendicant by name or clan, or by reverend. So you call him friend, basically. And a more junior mendicant ought to address a more senior mendicant using sir or venerable. Sir here is Bante, and venerable is ayasma. Ayasma means literally someone who is endowed with long life. So someone who is reverent because of their life experience or whatever. And so this is also a little bit interesting because it shows you that prior to the Buddha's passing away, the Sangha was very egalitarian. Everyone just called each other friend, avuso, or they called each other reverend, but it was a sense of equality. There wasn't that hierarchy there. And then of course, everyone called Buddha Bante. Bante is a reverential term or a veneration term, which means something like venerable or sir or something like that. And then when the Buddha passes away, then it seems that he has said then we should change how things are, and a more junior monk should then suddenly be more respectful of the more senior monks from this time on. So even in the present day, if you travel around the Buddhist world, this is how it works. A junior monk will always call a more senior monk venerable or Bante or something like that. Or Ajahn. Ajahn is kind of the Thai version, which means Acharya, like teacher. Or Sayadaw is the Burmese title being used. This is how you then refer to more senior people. But fascinating that in the earliest days it was more kind of egalitarian, it was more kind of flat hierarchy. Now it tends to be much more hierarchical, the way we do things. Anyway, I'm not sure what to make of that difference, but I guess the point is, the reason why the Buddha does this, I suppose, is because while he is still alive, there is a final reference point. There is a final authority that you can always go to and say, we have a problem. How do we resolve this? But once the Buddha is gone, that authority is lost. Yeah, there is no new teacher to take over, as I just mentioned before. So because of that, you need some kind of authority within the Sangha. Who should we listen to? Yeah, and of course, the more senior monks or monastics are the ones you should generally listen to. Not always, because sometimes you get senior monks who are really kind of foolish or whatever. Yeah, it depends. Yeah, obviously these things vary a lot. So not always, but generally speaking, a more senior monastic will have more experience than a junior one. So there is still some degree of authority there. I think this might be the point of this. Anyway, then actually we're coming very close. We can maybe have a look at this last one as well. Then, if it wishes, after my passing, the Sangha may abolish the lesser and minor training rules. Yeah, here it says the minor rules may be abolished. That is very interesting and very controversial. And the reason why it is very controversial, we will see this later on as we come further into the sutta, is that it is obviously there are some monastics who would very much like to get rid of some of these training rules. Yeah, they are kind of a nuisance or whatever, and you don't really want to have these training rules. And it's also very controversial because just earlier on in the very same sutta, the Buddha says, whatever I have laid down, you should keep. Yeah, you shouldn't abolish anything. That's what he said before, and now he's saying the exact opposite. Well, please get rid of the minor rules. So what is right? Did the Buddha say both? Is one of these wrong, the other one right? What is going on here? And it's very hard to make out, yeah, because the Buddha actually says both. But the other thing was said much earlier on. This is said at a much later point, just when he is about to pass away. And personally, I think that it is possible that he actually said both of these things. I think it is possible. It may just have been at different times. He was trying to make different points, yeah? And so he says, on the one hand, you should keep the rules, which you should, but if he gives the monastics an allowance, well, obviously then you don't have to keep them, or at least you don't have to keep certain rules. So it may very well be that he has done this. Why does he do this? And one reason could be that many of the rules that you find in the monastic training are rules that are very culturally bound. Not all the rules are like that, but many of the rules are like that. They belong maybe to a certain society and a certain place. They may not really be important. And so the Buddha says, well, if you want to abolish these rules, it's not going to really be a hindrance in your practice. As long as you live a moral life, you follow the Dhamma in the right way, then it may very well be that you can carry on like this. So it is a very kind of, you can imagine for the Sangha, it would have been very difficult to negotiate this. How do you decide whether you should do this or not? And and what actually happened later on, this is also part of the history of Buddhism, and you find this in the Vinaya Pitaka, is that after the Buddha passed away, they had a council where they recited all of these teachings, and there they decided that no, we have to keep the rules. And one of the reasons why they had to keep the rules is because they said, well, because the lay people know all our rules. And if we chuck them out, the lay people are going to say, well, as soon as the master dies, you just get rid of all your rules. What kind of dodgy bunch are you? That's what they're going to say, the lay people. Yeah, and of course they're going to say that. That's just the way things are. So they decided to keep all the rules. But it says something about the importance of the rules, even if we still live by these rules in the present day, and we do, and sometimes they are kind of inconvenient, and you wonder how important they are, and whether you know, and with this kind of passage you wonder whether you really need to keep them or not, but we do keep them, because that's what has been decided by tradition. But it also reminds you that these rules are not so important. There are certain rules in the Sangha that are absolutely fundamental. And the rules for monastics are divided into what they call heavy offenses and light offenses. And these minor rules here are the light offenses, whereas the heavy offenses are absolutely fundamental to the monastic life. So those you have to keep regardless. These lighter rules, well, you keep them, but you don't keep them very tightly. If there is room for interpretation, if there's room for looking at them in a certain way, then it's okay to interpret them in a way that is practical, that works. Yeah, this is kind of the point, because everything in the end of the day is interpretation. There's always interpretation with these things, and because of that, you don't kind of hold them too hard, basically, because they are not super important. And so this becomes important sometimes, because sometimes monastics can become very fiddly with these rules, and the monastics can become like lawyers. And I think some of these monastics, they probably would have been lawyers if it wasn't for the fact that they became monks and nuns. And they, because there is so much literature about these rules, you can spend your whole life just studying these rules, which is like a waste of time, because that's not what the monastic life is about. And you can become like a legal scholar of these Buddhist texts. But it's going beyond what is required. It's not really what these texts are about. So we shouldn't be slack about these rules. We should practice them according to how the Buddha laid them down, but we don't need to add a lot of extras, all the commentaries, all the traditions that you find in various countries. What you do is you kind of look at the essence of what the rule is, and you practice it according to as the Buddha said we should follow these particular rules. So a very interesting little point there of kind of Buddhist history. I think it is quite likely that the Buddha would have said this. Yeah. Why do I think it's likely? Well, who has the authority to say that you can get rid of all the rules? It's a bit strange, yeah, because it contradicts what the Buddha has said before. I think the only way that this kind of statement could have got into the sutta is because it comes from the greatest authority of all, which is the Buddha. So I think it is likely to be authentic, this particular passage there, because it is. I think there's a principle of textual studies to decide whether something is authentic or not. If something is there which seems to be contrary to what you would expect, it is likely to be authentic, because things that are contrary have a tendency to disappear out of the texts. Yeah, and this is kind of contrary to Buddhist history here. So for that reason, it seems to be likely to be true. Okay, so that is the one on the minor rules, and as always, I had hoped to get a bit further, but this never happens, and this is why this goes on for such a long time. So I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to stop there because we've been going for an hour and a half already. Is there any more questions or anything? Yes, John.
Just going back to that point of the person who came to the, I can't remember his name, but came to the Buddha and asked the last question, and he was supposed to become a streamwinder. You get that. There's quite a few occasions like that in the suttas where someone hears the teaching, but even in the Dhammaloka Sutta, one of the words. But if you also in the suttas, the Buddha says that you can't become a streamwinder unless you see non-self, and you can't get to non-self unless you get into the jhanas. So could you talk a bit on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you need, to be able to see that reality of non-self is a very profound reality, and it goes against the entire way that we're used to seeing the world. Everything, our experience, is that there is something called, there's a me in here, the I, and this I that is in here, it's very difficult to overturn that unless your mind is incredibly powerful, very, very strong, and very, very still. And this is why the suttas are so everywhere in the sutta, samadhi is always the requirement for yata bhuta nanadasana. Yata bhuta nanadasana means seeing things according to reality, and you need that samadhi, that stillness of the mind, to be incredibly profound before you can do that, because it is such a revolution in our inner life when we see these things. It's a big, big change in how we see the world. You need that power of the mind to be able to do that. And so, for that reason, you're quite right. It seems very suspicious. I hear someone who's just talking to the Buddha. There's no kind of sense that he's been practicing samadhi. He's just come out of the village, and he's supposed to become a stream mentor. Actually, in the Pali version, he doesn't become a stream mentor. In the other version, he becomes a stream mentor. So that's why I find it very hard to kind of accept that, because it needs that meditation beforehand. But as you say, it's not just here. It is something you find in many places in the suttas. You find it in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. You find it in a large number of small suttas, where the Buddha just gives them a teaching, and then gives them the Four Noble Truths, and they become stream mentors. So what is going on? Well, when about the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is a bit different. This is the first sermon of the Buddha, the Dhammacakkappavattana, the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dhamma. In that sutta, the studies of that sutta suggest that actually it didn't all happen in one session. It happened over a period of time, and later on it was kind of amalgamated into one sutta. Yeah, but actually it happened over. First of all, the Buddha on one session talked about the middle way, which you would expect. He had to convince them that there was a middle way. Shouldn't practice severe asceticism or tormenting the body. And only later on did he teach them the Four Noble Truths. Yeah, there was a period of time in which they practiced in between. And these were 5 ascetics. Quite likely they already had good samadhi. Yeah? So in that setting, I think it's quite possible that Anya Kondanya actually did become a stream mentor. It was only one of them that became a stream mentor. That was Anya Kondanya. And remember, the Buddha is surprised. Yeah, wow, Anya Kondanya is a stream mentor. He uses the expression vatabo, anyasi vatabo kondanyo. Anyasi, he understands. Vatabo is like, wow, he understands. Yeah. And he's very surprised because he doesn't know yet whether Dhamma is going to be efficacious, whether he's going to be able to pass this on. So it's like really a wow moment for the Buddha. But then you have all these other instances you talk about in the suttas where the Buddha gives a graduated training on generosity, on sila, on renunciation and these things. And then when at the end of that teaching, then he tells the teaching that is specific to the Buddha, which is dukkha, arising of dukkha, cessation, and the path. And then they become stream entries. Yeah? And that, it looks like, when you just read these individual suttas, it looks like everything happens in one go. But remember, almost all of those suttas that are like that, it's a very important point, are narrative suttas. They are a narrative, just like the sutta here is a narrative, often condensed narrative, that brings out the highlight of what happened with this person. The reality behind it, we don't know. It's just the highlight that is brought out. Like the graduation ceremony, I think Ajahn Brahmali calls it sometimes. You see the graduation point, but you don't actually see all that happened in between. And quite likely this happened over a long period of time. They became converted. Then he taught them the gradual path, maybe over weeks, over months perhaps, and then eventually they became stream mentors, they saw the truth. But actually, it very likely didn't happen in one sitting, it happened over time. Except maybe under very special circumstances where people were already ascetics, they already had really good meditation, they were ready for these teachings, and then the eye of the Dhamma can kind of open up in the last moment. Maybe people like Venerable Sariputta, who is supposed to have had that kind of experience. He went into the city, Venerable Asaji was there, one of the first 5 disciples. He taught them the very simple teaching, everything that arises must cease, and bang, he became a stream mentor. Kind of amazing. I don't know if it probably didn't happen like that, even for Venerable Sariputta probably didn't happen like that, but he might, because he was the wisest person in the entire Sangha. So that, I think, is the right way of interpreting this. And I think that the kind of usual interpretation that often is used, reading the suttas and kind of reading this as stream entry happening right away, I think it is too simplistic. Yeah, things aren't just that simple. You can't just take it literally the way it stands there. You have to. These suttas always have there's a context. You have to use wisdom to really understand what is going on. That's a very important point. So thank you for bringing it up. I know you probably knew the answer already, but you brought it up, and that's kind of a good point. Okay, anyone else? Oh, from outside. Anyone else here want to say anything here? Please don't be shy. Are you shy, or are you? Sometimes people think, oh, I don't know anything about the suttas, I'm really afraid of asking. Please don't be afraid of asking. If you don't know anything, it's good. You're allowed to ask really basic questions, yeah? It's perfectly okay here. No question is foolish. There's no such thing as a foolish question. But I know it is always a bit kind of shaky when you feel you don't know anything and you want to ask and you think, oh, should I ask this or not? But Honorable Ananda wants to ask something. Okay, that's because you know so much. Yeah, you're not one of the newbies.
No, just on your authenticity project, Ajahn, that sentence. If they wish, the order may abolish the minor rules after my passing.
Yeah.
Is it there in the other, like Chinese Agama?
It is there everywhere.
It is there.
Yeah. It is in all of them. So that's why it seems to be authentic. Yeah. And I've always found that these things that are so contradictory and so different, there are a few of those in the Sutta, things that seem really weird, out of place. You seem completely disrespectful of the Buddha or whatever. How did they get in there? Nobody would dare to put them in there. quite likely they're authentic. Yeah, that's the way I look at these things. Yeah, and this is apparently one of the classic ways of deciding on the authenticity of these kind of scriptures.
Thank you, Ajahn.
Yeah.
And also what John said, that Upali Sutta, in the Upali Sutta, Ajahn, even being a disciple of the Nigantanatha Putta,
Yeah,
the Upali became streamed according to that sutta.
he did. Yeah,
So he probably may have been practicing jhanas.
he may have. Yeah, although the Nigantanatha Putta are not supposed to have taught jhanas, but anyway, yeah.
So he,
Yeah.
Subhadda was not a householder, he was a wanderer. Sorry, Ajahn. Subhadda was not a householder,
He was a wanderer.
he was a wanderer.
Yeah.
So he may have been practicing meditation.
He may have, and quite possibly he was. But just the way he came from the city, and then he came to visit the Buddha. It didn't look like it at this particular point, but it could be. But anyway, in the Pali, it doesn't say he became a stream enterer, so it's not an issue. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, Kanchana. Okay.
Ajahn, you said you don't know how, just then you just said, you don't know how people would have dared to put some things in there, into the suttas, you know, some sections, and so they're most likely to be authentic. So I constantly am asking myself, how would they dare to put anything in there at all, especially when the Buddha said to take the Dhamma and the Vinaya as the head of the religion, basically. What reasons do you have? What do you think the reasons might be that I mean, some of the things like that we were talking about Kusinara and why later Buddhists were trying to maybe jazz it up a bit or whatever, but I mean, if you look at it in terms of just Dhamma and Vinaya and you take that as your standard, it's, you know, if you practice, and it's a very simple thing, you know, sometimes practice feels yucky and you just have to persevere. And it's just very simple, it's very humble.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine that a Buddha of all beings, all types of beings, would care what happened in the past when he was passing away. You know? But why would they put something like that?
Absolutely.
Why? I've constantly been asking, what reasons did they have?
I think you have a very good point. I think it's exactly that is why the traditions have been so conservative, you know, because they realize that the Buddha from the very beginning, he wanted to conserve these things. He has told them in many places during this Mahaparinibbana Sutta, conserve these teachings, make sure that this is your teacher. And of course, they would have been very careful. He talks about how they should chant these things together, recite them together to preserve them for the future. All of these things are found there in the suttas. So because of that, I think the tradition would have been incredibly conservative, very, you know, really wanting to preserve the word of the Buddha. And that is precisely why, because, you know, what comes out of the comparative study is precisely that these suttas, after 2,500 years, they're still virtually the same. You know, these schools split apart. We know that historically around the time of Ashoka, 2,300 years ago, translated into different languages. One became into Chinese, some into Tibetan, some in Sanskrit, some in Pali, and yet you translate them back into English and they look almost exactly the same. And that's kind of, you know, really astonishing here. And then the only really good explanation for that is that they were very, very conservative. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened. Yeah, you couldn't have that kind of degree of conservation unless they were very conservative. And that conservativeness obviously would have been inherited from the Buddha. If the Buddha hadn't laid that down, well, they would have done their own thing. They would have become whatever else. So the reason why this happens is because basically it happens because they actually think they are preserving the word of the Buddha. That's why it happens. So later generations, and many of these people who were perhaps the reciters of the suttas, they may not have been Aryans, they may not have known what was the best way to look after the suttas, and they just wanted to glorify the Buddha. Yeah, they just wanted to make the Buddha into something more important, something more wow. How can that be wrong? It must be right, surely. Yes? No? Maybe? I think it's wrong, yeah. We think it's wrong because we're coming from a different perspective, but a lot of people will think that is right. If you look at the Buddhist world today, and if you look at the amount of people who are kind of, you know, so keen on supernormal things and all these kind of things, everybody once talks about that. Yeah, wow, I saw this monk, you know, flying through the air. Of course, nobody ever sees that. Always someone else sees it. Yeah, oh, the person who saw it is not here now. It's always like that. But But this is kind of the staple of the Buddhist world, supernormal phenomena. And of course, the Buddha would have been the primary exponent of those supernormal phenomena because he's the head of everything. So this is just a way of glorifying the Buddha. And you see this and you can see this very clearly as you go through the Buddhist history and you look at later texts like commentaries or subcommentary or whatever, the further away from the Buddha you get, the more glorified the Buddha is. So you can see a trend there. And of course, that trend you can see would have started in the suttas. You come to the Mahayana suttas, and it's absolutely astonishing. The sutta starts off with 10 pages, literally 10. I've read some of these suttas, like the Prajnaparamita Sutta, which is one of the main suttas of the Mahayana. 10 pages, first of all, of just marvelous and incredible events. And they really are marvelous and incredible, really beyond anything that you can possibly believe. So this is a trend in history, and because it is a trend in history, you can assume it would have started fairly early on, especially after the Buddha passed away. Everybody felt a lack, they had to do something. Who was the Buddha? And things start to evolve in that way. But it's not just the glorification of the Buddha that evolves, but also the suttas themselves sometimes. One of the very interesting books about the suttas is Bhante Sujata's book, The History of Mindfulness, which shows the evolution of Satipatthana Sutta. And there you see a similar kind of thing. And that thing that you see there is just that people say, well, Satipatthana Sutta as it is, there are more aspects to it that the Buddha taught elsewhere. So we need to put those aspects in there. We're not actually destroying anything. All we're doing is kind of making it more complete. So we have one sutta that is complete, that contains everything. So sometimes it is not as if they don't take things away. They don't destroy suttas, but sometimes they add more material to make something more complete and proper. So when you look at the Satipatthana Sutta today, and you compare the Satipatthana Sutta in its various recensions, they are very different. And the only way you can explain that is sometime through history, somebody would have added aspects to the sutta. Otherwise, there's no way you could have ended up with sutta that was so different in the various traditions. So it's not... People are not doing this because they want to destroy Buddhism. They're not doing this. They're doing it out of faith, because they actually think they are making it safe for the future. But actually, what is actually happening is that by doing that, you are actually distorting the suttas in small ways. I sometimes think that I was a monastic in a past life, because I can't really explain why I'm a monastic now. And I would be horrified to see myself in that situation. It's a good idea. Let's add a paragraph here. Quite likely I was there, and maybe many of us was doing precisely that because it seemed right. But now we are coming from a different historical perspective, so suddenly it doesn't seem right anymore. So it's not like you are judging others for doing the bad thing. Quite likely we did exactly those things. That's kind of the scary thing about this. And now we have to rectify our own mistakes from the past. Kind of get back to the reality again. So that is how I think these things come about. It's not malevolent or malicious or anything like that. It's just humans being stupid, being silly, not having enough insight, not understanding what is going on. That's the problem.
Thank you.
Ajahn Brahmali, I think the Buddha also did say that in the future you're allowed to alter some of his rules and regulations to suit the situation.
Not really. No.
I think something like that. In future,
it may be that you're referring to this one, Eddie. This one here may be what you're referring to. Because this I think is the only place where he talks about the abolition of rules. I don't think he talks about it anywhere else. Do you have anything specific in mind, or you heard? Okay. I think it may be the reference to this one here. I think this is what it's talking about, and this is already interesting enough. This is very similar to what you're talking about. I don't think there is anything else, unless my memory is kind of messing with me, which is quite possible. But anyone else? Happy? Okay. Happy enough. Okay. Let's have a quick look at these from a couple of questions from overseas, both from Germany, and the first one is, why didn't the Buddha choose intentionally to be reborn one more time to really prove his teachings? The reason is because you cannot choose that. This is a Mahayana Buddhist idea that you can choose to be reborn. But the point of the Buddha is that he has destroyed that seed which allows rebirth to happen. Rebirth can only happen through craving. Craving is the driver of samsaric existence, including rebirth. Without craving, you cannot be reborn. It's not something you can choose. This is a later idea in Buddhism, and it implies that you are not enlightened. If you can choose to be reborn, you're not enlightened. Yeah. So this is kind of part of the problem there. So that choice is not open to the Buddha. He has made an end of things, and he doesn't need to prove his teachings. He knows the reality of rebirth. It's there, and anyone who is enlightened will know that. This is one of the knowledges you have as part of awakening, is that you know the reality of rebirth. You know the causality, the causal connection between craving on the one hand and rebirth on the other. You see how these are connected, cause and result, connected to each other. Question number 2. When you have chronic pain, it is hard to get deep meditation. How did the Buddha handle the human sufferings he had also as a human being? The way that the way to handle this is that you're not worried about these things. Yeah, you are able to let go of these things. The reason why it is hard to meditate when you have pains in the body is because you are a little bit obsessed by it. You are a little bit attached to it. The mind goes there because the mind is concerned about the body. That is the problem. But if you are not concerned about these pains, and this is what the Buddha is, he knows it is there, but he's not attached to it, he's not worried about it. Because of that, he can just focus on something different. He doesn't need to focus on the pain. So he focuses on the breath, for example, and then when he focuses on the breath, he lets go of that, then he can go into deep samadhi to a place where the pain is completely gone and he doesn't experience anymore. And you may remember that there is an earlier part of this sutta where the Buddha says that my body is only comfortable when I go into the animita ceto samadhi, the signless deliverance of mind. Only then am I, is my body free from pain. Or that could be a jhana state or whatever, but you need to go beyond the body, and then you are free from these things. So this is hard for people to do precisely because we have attachments to the body. It's difficult to let go. It's difficult to focus on the breath if you have some very serious chronic pains. It's hard. Yeah? So what you have to do is you have to try your very best. And you have to, sometimes maybe you can use a little bit of medication to help you overcome that pain, as long as it doesn't make you too dull and drowsy or whatever. And see if you can somehow deal with that pain in a skillful way to go beyond that pain. That is the ideal. But it's not an easy thing to do. When you have chronic pain,